Hi, you're listening to the Young Leaders Podcast, a show that inspires creatives and motivates you to make a meaningful impact in the world. My name is Filippo Bagarella, and I'll be your guide to success as we interview young leaders, selfishly asking them about their progress and the lessons in life they've learned so far. Because if they can do it, you can do it. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Isabel Randall.
Hey, thank you so
Hi.
much for having me.
Hi.
Hi.
How are ya?
Doing good, doing
Oh
good.
my gosh, this is gonna be fun.
I think so, yeah.
All right, well, tell me a little bit about you, about your origins.
For sure. So I was born actually on a U.S. naval base in Rota, Spain. So on the southern coast of Spain. The closest major city to Rota is Sevilla. So it's on the southern coast, right off of what is known as a body of water called the Strait of Gibraltar. So an hour boat ride from Africa. And from that point, I was born there. And then 16 months later, I was in Illinois. And then I tell people to pick a state because it's really hard to say where I'm from. I've lived in 11 states. So Boston, Massachusetts makes my 11th move in 11th state. But then as far as addresses, I've changed my address, over 20 times, as many years I've been alive. I'm 26 and I stopped counting after 20.
So, if I were to ask you, um, what do you consider home?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, I find myself a lot going back to the definition of a home or hometown. And so I just say Rota as like the basics to make it easier, Rota, Spain. But in the true sense of like home, of what a home means, I would say my home is whenever I am in music. That's where I found my identity. That's where I found my solace, if you will, within music. I started playing piano when I was 3. I played for about 8 years. And then from that point on, I was like, I'm not going to do any more piano. But I've always kept music in my life. I did choirs out through school and throughout college. And then that kind of led me into opera. But we can get into a little more about all the detours I took from that point because there were a lot. My journey to becoming an opera singer, I say, is extremely unusual. But yeah, I would say the major thread was with music for sure, with being my home.
Yeah, it's interesting how you, instead of thinking of home as a material place,
Hmm.
you think of it as more of a concept,
Absolutely.
which is actually very interesting if you think about it.
Mhm.
Um, if I were to ask you then, when was your epiphany moment?
So it's twofold. With the epiphany moment, I would say the first inclination was with my very first voice teacher in high school, Miss Jessie Kinkle. I had just moved from North Carolina to Texas, and I received a scholarship to do voice lessons. Because at the time, my parents weren't able to afford the voice lessons with this specific teacher. I mean, she was a very well respected, well known teacher. She was known for getting students to major music schools throughout the state of Texas, and major competitions and what have you. So when I was studying with her, Miss Hinkle, I remember being in a lesson with her, and I was telling her, "Oh, my dream one day, I was like, I said it this way: it'd be cool to be on Broadway." And she was like, "Okay." And so we did some Broadway and musical theater, and then she was like, "I think your voice could do a little more." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she was like, "Have you ever thought of singing opera?" And I was like, "Opera." I was like, "I've heard of opera." And then I was like, "Phantom of the Opera?" And she was like, "No, not that's a musical." And she was like, "No, she's like, "Have you ever heard of the name of Jesse Norman?" And at the time, I was like, "Who's Jesse Norman?" She's like, "Okay." And this was like at the end of my lesson. She's like, "Okay, your homework is to go home, and I want you Google search on YouTube, Mon cœur se va te voir, which translates to "My heart opens to your voice." It's French for "My heart opens to your voice." It's from the opera called Samson and Delilah. And I played it on YouTube, and I was like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to get to this point, but I want to do this. Because when Jessie Norman opened her mouth, I was just like, this is, the human voice can do this. That's so
Mm-hmm.
cool. And she was just like standing there, and like she wasn't really, it was just her just being on stage. It was just like she just embodied not only the character but just her voice had so many nuances. It was so cool. That's the first epiphany. The second one is when I actually first got to Boston in 2021. I had just finished my master's at Azusa Pacific University, and I had finished doing that. And at the time, I wasn't doing anything with a live orchestra or anything or conductor. And what had happened was I ended up having to do most of my stuff online. And from being in Boston, I was given an opportunity at Laundry School of Music to do the role of Ruggiero in their fall production of Alcina. And that was my first time with orchestra and with a conductor and with a live audience. And after that show, I remember feeling like, okay, this was a heck of a lot of work to this, but it was such an exhilaration, such a rush. I was like, I want to do this again. I was like, I am ready to wake up at 7 a.m, keep doing it. I was like, if I can keep doing this. That was my second epiphany to music and specifically opera.
How old were you then exactly?
I was 24 going on 25.
Okay, so let's take a step back then. Have you ever had in your career until this point, have you ever had anyone tell you that you weren't gonna make it? Because what most people go through, especially at the beginning, what they experience is usually someone telling them that they can't do what they're actually really good at doing. Yeah. So did you have that moment?
Absolutely. So you're bringing me right back to, if we're talking about like years, let's take it back to the summer of 2018. The summer of 2018 was entering my senior year of college at Baylor University. And at the time, I was in the School of Music. I wasn't in the vocal performance world yet. I was doing church music, Bachelor of Arts church music specifically. And I specify Bachelor of Art because, and we can get to this more, my journey throughout college, I switched my major. I was pre-med neuroscience, and then I switched to Bachelor of Art music, specifically church music, because of the graduation requirements and to really make sure I, to the best of my ability, graduate with my class of 2019, which I ended up doing. It took a lot of work, but we ended up getting to the finish line. The summer of 2018, I was at a crossroads with whether I wanted to keep going on with church music and become a worship minister, work in the church, or really go for my dream and really go after performing arts, specifically with opera. I knew the amount of work that was still yet to be done to pursue that, but I was like, that is what I want to do. I would always think back to when I was 17, 18, back with my teacher, Jesse Hinkle, back in Texas. And I just knew, like, from that moment of when she played me that video and moving forward, that memory always was like a core memory in my head. I was like, yes, I'm doing music, but I'm like, it's not what I want to do to pursue it. Because I kind of felt myself leaning to complacency. So anyway, moving forward towards summer of 2018, I'm sitting down with my current voice teacher at the time at Baylor, and I was chatting with her about my desire and what I wanted to do after Baylor was to pursue an opera degree and performance degree. At the time, I was considering also musical theater, but the main thing was opera. And I was sitting with her at a Starbucks at the library. I remember it clear as day. And I was sitting across from her, and I was telling her all of this, and I was like so excited. I put it all down. I was like, okay, I want to apply to this master's program. I was like, I know I don't have the credits, I know, but I was like, I want to at least try. And I remember her specifically telling me, she was like, I don't see you as doing this. In fact, I don't think you should go after this. She even gave me a suggestion of going into an arts administration degree or something of that nature. And I played devil's advocate. I'm like, I see where she was coming from. I was a community leader. I was a resident assistant. I did have many other skills outside of music. I got that. But I felt like at the time she was hearing me, but she wasn't listening to my desire and my passion of what I wanted to do. And so when she was saying that she didn't see me as doing opera and she didn't see me as, even musical theater or whatever, performing, that took a hit. I didn't really, at the time, I kind of walked away from that conversation. I was like, wow, I thought we could move forward. And I felt like I felt like kind of stymied. And it was kind of a moment in my being 21, I was like, okay, I can either take this and just stop and just like be like, okay, she doesn't see me as this. Why should I keep moving forward? And I ended up calling my mom, and I was telling her, I was like, Mom, I was like, my teacher, she's saying that I shouldn't even do this career. I shouldn't even pursue this. And my mom was like, what do you want to do? She's like, oh, sorry, excuse me. She said, not what are you going to do? What do you want to do? That's what my mom specifically said. And I said, I want to pursue a career in opera. She said, do it. And we hung up. I went a week later. I went back to my teacher, went to my lesson. I said, I know what you were telling me last week about not pursuing this. And I told her, I didn't say I want to try. I said, I'm going to try. I'm going to try. And I submitted 3 applications. And I just go back. I think from that moment, from that conversation, it kind of lit a fire in me. I was like, prove, it was kind of, there's a saying that like, prove them wrong. And then from that point on, my teacher was like, in a way, like, she was like, okay, we'll try. But then she was like, you have all these requirements. I was like, I know. I was like, I'm aware of like what I have, that like what's outstanding. I was like, I'm going to at least try. And I was like, if these schools don't want me, that's fine. And then along the way, she was, going along. But I will say, like, I won't forget that moment of like when it was like, you can't do this. And I would also pause and say, like, to anyone who's like listening, like, if there's anyone or there's anything that's like you feel like is a barrier to what you want to do to be successful, I would say, in that moment, you have to kind of remind yourself of your reason why you are pursuing after what you want to do in the first place. And there will be people along the way who may discourage you or may say you can't do it. But I would say in those challenging moments, that is when you find within yourself to rise above it. Because I know if I didn't, I wouldn't be sitting across from you today. So,
well, taking a step back again, 21 was the age where they told you that you shouldn't pursue, right?
Yes.
That is such an early age because, we are very vulnerable at that age.
Absolutely.
And the fact that somebody feels like they have the, in a way, the authority, right, to tell you what to do and not to do in the future, it really tends to then impact your future in a very strong way. Mm-hmm. So the fact that then you listen to your mom, and what's your relationship with your parents?
Oh, gosh.
Because the fact that you listened to her and now you've achieved what you've achieved now, it means that if it weren't for your mom telling you pursue it, you probably wouldn't have.
I mean, I do have to. I'll give like a super quick detour. Like, I do have to give my mom a huge shout out, like, to this whole like career like I'm doing right now. Because seriously, I was a very stubborn kid in high school. Like, this same moment of like, prove them wrong type of thing. I remember I was 14. I was in the car with my mom. I was about to head into freshman orientation at my high school in North Carolina, now over 10 years ago. And I was sitting with her. We were going back and forth. This was around the time where I had already finished. So I had finished piano for 8 years, and then I was like, I'm not going to do piano anymore. And then I went a step further in that car right before freshman orientation. I dropped a bomb on my mom. I was like, I'm not signing up for choir. She's like, what? You're not? And then we were going back and forth. I was like, it's not worth it. I want to be a doctor. And then she gave me this ultimatum. Basically, she's like, try for 1 semester. And if you hate it, I will never ask you again.
You wanted to be a doctor?
Yes.
Tell me about it.
For sure. So I've always had a desire to help people. That was always what I wanted to do. I didn't know in what capacity I could do that. I didn't think at the time in high school, elementary school, that it would be through music. I kind of saw that as like more of like a hobby, or like even as I got older, like a more risky career. Becoming a doctor actually stemmed from medical procedures that I had done. So I had many different career paths that I thought of. I was interested in science from the time when I was a little kid. I had a really, really, really strong interest. Like, I was such a nerd for all things like marine biology and science. I wanted to become a marine biologist at one point. But then, and then also because I loved to swim and all the, like, it all tracked. And there was one point I wanted to become an Olympic swimmer, and I was on competitive swim teams when I was living in Florida. And my coaches were like, oh, we're going to put you on this team, blah, blah, blah. And everything was starting to like add up to really head towards like training towards like major swimming competitions and stuff. Then we moved to North Carolina, and I started noticing something going funny under my arms. And I was like, it was painful to move my arms. And I was like, what's going on? What's going on? My mom thought it was just like ingrown hair under my arms. And she's like, it's fine, puberty, whatever. But it started growing, and it started becoming even noticeable. And then it started growing to the size of about my fist. And like, it felt like decks of cards under my arms. I was like, that's not good. And so my parents took me to the pediatrician, and my pediatrician was like, I don't think it's an ingrown hair. Let's do a culture on this and let's get it. And then they're like, oh, we need to transfer you to another hospital. I was like, okay. And then they did like some like cuts underneath and like checked me out. And like, and then the doctor's like, you have a you have a skin condition called hidradenitis suppurativa, which is a long, long name for basically abscess under your arms, but it's an autoimmune. So your body basically creates these abscess, and it can be in any like it can be like in your groin, it can be in just very uncomfortable places underneath your stomach, like it can just be in the nooks and crannies of the human body. Mine were in both of my underarms, and there were points where, and especially at such a vulnerable point in middle school and high school, just having to deal with like, I learned how to dress myself, meaning dressings of like these cotton cloths and tape, and I would tape myself every morning, every night, and I would have to clean underneath, and it was just really painful. And but throughout that time and throughout that, and then I should also say, there was a point also where I had to like get, I got one surgery. Sorry, I did get one surgery, and they gutted out most of the gunk, but it didn't get rid of the problem. And so it ended up growing back, and it was even worse. And then in high school, they ended up having to just go in and actually remove my sweat glands, which was actually a very risky procedure, because then they would get into your nerves, and like the risk, like they could potentially paralyze you underneath there. But thankfully they didn't. There are times where it does like affect me, because I do like, since I almost have zero sweat glands underneath, so I tend to like overheat. But in either case, all that to say, throughout all of my medical procedures with that specifically, and at such a young age, I became really engrossed in medicine. And I was like, you know what, I could do this. And I was with doctors like all the time, and nurses all the time, and going to the hospital maybe every other month, maybe once a month, maybe sometimes twice a month. So yeah, that really brought me into like, oh, I can help myself. Oh, I can help other people feel better. And that kind of got me onto the pre-med track. I was on neuroscience track as well. I just loved being a lifelong learner. But then my personal experiences brought me to be a doctor.
So that was pure case that you actually ended up in music.
Mm-hmm.
Because you were actually pretty much set in the medical world.
Oh, absolutely. If my mom wasn't tooth and nail with me, my mom, I mean, when you asked me about the relationship with my parents, like, I'm close to both my mom and my dad. But I would say me and my mom have a very special relationship because our personalities are very, very similar. She's like the one person who can like literally like talk me down, or like it's the one person, like, because if I'm like set on something, I'm set on something. Like my sisters can try to talk to me, but it's like my mom like knows exactly what to say, and I'm like, all right, she can read my poker face, if you will.
2 words: stage fright.
Ooh.
So being in the in this type of industry, both of us, we know that being in stage can require a lot of nerves. Reason why, I backed off. So what really keeps you also going from that nerve-wracking, I call it anxiety, because if you think about it, you are being looked at and judged, and people are listening to you, and what if you get it wrong? So what is your philosophy under all this? How do you deal with that?
I would say with stage fright, it comes from just being secure in who I am. That's what is, I would say, the antidote, if you will, to stage fright. It's not like a end all be all, like a, one size fits all cure. But I would say, like, for anyone listening, like, in whatever you're pursuing, like, you have to 110% be be secure in who you are, and then also know and believe in your abilities, because that in and of itself, whatever happens on stage, nerves are good and they can help us and keep us in the moment and keep us quick on our feet, but at the same time with stage fright, and I guess this kind of like leans into like imposter syndrome, because during my first couple of years of studying and then performing opera, I found myself being like, well, I've only been studying this, let's say like a year and then maybe 2 years or whatever. Now I'm going into my fourth year of studying opera, which still is a very, very short time. But I would say that very first year, I was like, kind of like, oh my gosh, like, so and so is whatever than me, and then it kind of goes into comparison, which is such a trap, and like it's very secular. It like goes and goes and goes, cyclical, and it goes and goes and goes. So I'd say with stage fright, it has to start with, at the end of the day, I ask myself, like, is the Isabel off stage the same Isabel on stage? Again, there it goes into, we play different characters on stage in opera and we tell different stories, but in this true sense of the word, it's like my interpretation of, for example, Carmen, of Carmen, is not going to be the same interpretation as was Jesse Norman's or was Sandra Peak's Eddie, or these people that have played Carmen for years and years and years. But that is okay, right? So it goes into saying, like, with stage fright, you have to be sure of who you are, because then if you're not, you can land into trouble. And I'm speaking from a place of where I've been in those situations of like, okay, I'm not really being myself. I'm just being what someone told me to be.
Yeah, but I guess this also brings us to connect the dots and also add something new, which is rejection. I mean, and failure.
Yeah.
What people don't probably realize in this type of scenario, but also in other type of industries, is that we do have to fail in order to succeed. I mean, failure is required in a way in order to get to where we want to be. Now, the sad part is that people don't talk about it. Therefore, in our generation particularly, we're not used to seeing people fail. Therefore, we think it's wrong. We think it's something like that's slowing us down. But actually, I believe that it's required. What do you think about that?
I would say that for me, failure has kind of been, with this audition season that I'm currently in, which has been my most extensive, the fuel that's been keeping me going, which has never been the case for me, like, ever in anything, which tells me one thing that's very clear is that I know without a shadow of a doubt I'm in the career that's meant for me, because the fact that I'm not letting failure discourage me from moving forward, because I have this audition season, gosh, I don't know, I don't even remember, I can't even tell you how many trains and planes I've been on, like, just to audition, and for different jobs, for different companies, for competitions, putting myself out there, saying this similar introduction every time, sometimes starting with a different song or aria, which is specifically the term we use for songs that are performed solo by people on stage. And I can't tell you how many times I've done that over and over and over again. It's very vulnerable and it's very jarring. And not to say that it doesn't get, it's not to say like it gets easier, because that's not true. It actually gets harder every time, because year after year, for and I should say that for my colleagues, because I can't say year after year because this is like my first big audition season. But I will say the failure is fuel for me because of the fact that I view each audition as an opportunity, and just seizing the moment of like, okay, I'm going to put all out on the table, everything I got, because the fact that I'm given an opportunity to sing an audition, that's huge. Because in opera, in America, I can't really speak for Europe because that's another incredibly huge opera hub, specifically in Europe. But in the United States, it's even more competitive because there's less opera houses here. In Europe, one of my mentors in the opera world had told me once, there are more opera houses than churches in Germany, for example. And in the United States, that's not the case. In Boston specifically, there is one major opera house, Boston Lyric Opera. And then you can speak for other states, there's maybe tops 3 big opera houses in that state, but in any way, and competitions as well. But with that being said, anytime that I'm given a chance to live audition, you have to assume that hundreds and hundreds of applicants have been told no. So when you're given a yes to audition, that's a win. Even if you don't get the job, which that's something I'm learning of, like, okay, I didn't get the job this year, but the fact that I can say, like, looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've sung for this person. I'm like, I'm not even 2 years in professionally, and I've already sung for this people. That's huge.
So it's interesting because you're actually underlining more of the mindset rather than the actual setting, which is very important, I think, because most people forget that they're in the moment, and that they are auditioning for even a very important organization.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're trying to tell me, correct me if I'm wrong, is that even if they say no, it is okay because you got there.
Correct.
You got there, and you have all your life to succeed in that audition.
Absolutely.
Wow. So let's take a big step back. Sure. And how was your childhood? Meaning, I know you traveled a lot, and I can relate personally with that because I traveled a lot for my parents' job as well. And I have to say personally, and I want to know if you can relate to that, I have had a really hard time connecting with other kids and making friends, especially if I knew that I was going to leave in like a year or so. How did you live through that? How did you process that?
Yeah. The moves in my childhood were, especially when I got older, it was a mindset of just survival mode, if you will. And survival mode meaning, not to say like I was put in any danger or anything like that. I would say from a social standpoint, I found myself, if I could compare myself to anything, like I felt like a chameleon. I was just blending in to each place, picking up on the colloquialisms, the common sayings, if you will, just to make it. Because saying like the question of where are you from, like it's a very loaded question for me. It still is to this day. And even to this day, like when I tell people, oh, I was from Spain, like they're like, oh, well, you don't look like it, for example. And I'm like, okay, right. I was like, my parents are American. They're like, oh, I get it. And so we cross over one barrier. Okay. And it's like, okay, we're in the clear now. And they're like, okay, but where are you really from? And then I'm like, well, my parents are from New Orleans. They're like, oh, like you're from New Orleans then. I'm like, no, I'm not. And then it's like another hurdle. And then it goes into many things. And I go to say all these layers is because my concept of like social interactions from being a little kid, I mean, to get even more deeper, like I didn't recognize, I guess, my blackness, if you will, until I was about like 6 or 7, because I lived in mostly predominantly white neighborhoods, in suburban areas, and being like kind of the 1 or 2 like black kids in the class, like I didn't, not to say like I had like any like problems like racially with anyone, but it's just I didn't realize like that difference or like understanding like my culture until I was like 6 or 7, if you will.
So you never had any racist incident in your life?
No, not to say that. I shouldn't say that. No, I'm saying like early on, like early childhood years. I didn't recognize the significance of like being black and what that means in America. Like I didn't understand all of that, like the levels of that until I was like 6 or 7. It just kind of, I was like, oh, like, um, one funny thing. I mean, I don't think I have the paper anymore. Uh, but we had to like in kindergarten we had to describe ourselves, and I said I'm brown and sort of like a circle. So that's what I mean of like the deeper implications of like race and stuff. I didn't understand that till I was like 6 or 7.
So, talking about that, have you ever experienced? No, you're telling me that you were very very good at trying to be part of the culture you were getting
Yeah,
into and making
yeah.
friends, but did you ever have anyone who was not okay with that and who actually bullied you for that or
Um,
bullied in general?
I think it was like twofold. I think in middle school, for me, I can only speak from like my personal experience. Like because I lived in mostly like predominantly white neighborhoods, I kind of assimilated to like what that culture was, or like what most of my friends would like listen to. So like, um, I didn't really grow up with having a lot of like friends who were black. And so when I got to middle school in North Carolina specifically, that was my first deep dive into like black culture. I mean, of course, I would visit my cousins every now and again in the summers, in the South, but again, it was maybe for a couple of days at a time. And then like New Orleans, we would try to go every year, but it was just like my extended family, so it wasn't. I didn't really grasp like any cultural things, and I should even further on and say like I didn't really get a chance to experience like black culture until like college even, but I would say like middle school was my first like experience with that, and I didn't really know a lot about like, for example, like Jay-Z or like Lupe Fiasco. Like I didn't know like these names. And so like when the kids at the school were like try to like talk to me about like different stuff, and like I was like, oh, I don't know, and I would be like, oh, by like listening to like for example, I was like Demi Lovato or like or like Jonas Brothers, like people were like, oh, you like this music. And so I kind of felt like, oh, like, am I was like, it was like kind of like identity crisis, like, oh, like what is my culture of like, I don't fit into this crowd, I don't fit into that crowd. So it was kind of just felt like it was very disorienting because I had been to all these places, but then it's kind of like, well, who am I? And like, am I just like gravitating towards things just to like fit in? Yes, I was. So it was, yeah, it was isolating. So that from that point, I just kind of turned to my academics and just really didn't really hang out with a lot of people during that time, just because I was like, well, I don't fit into this crowd, I don't fit in that one, so I'm just gonna kind of put my head down and get to work. And I was extremely like academically wise, I was thriving, but socially and emotionally and mentally I was deteriorating.
Exactly, and this is where I want to also get to. You traveled a lot.
Yeah.
You, yes and no, saw your family members every
Hmm.
now and then. You were told to change career. I mean, was there a breaking point ever?
Yeah, so like going back to middle school, like the deterioration, like academically I was thriving, like seventh seventh grade, it's like 13. um and at the time I was just kind of at a point where I was like, like I was just questioning of like, what am I even doing here, meaning like my life in and of itself. And this 2023 marks, um yeah, a little over 10, 11 years from when I was gonna attempt suicide.
Mm.
And it was a point where I knew what I was planning to do. And for me, like, I would say, like, another thread, like, besides music, was, like, my belief in, like, in God. And I believe, like, he was with me like to stop me from doing that, because I don't know how because I don't recall my mom being in the house, or like I don't recall like any. I believe I was home alone, if I'm not mistaken. And I had the letter ready. I was by the window, which was my plan, like part of the plan, by the window. I had already laid everything out to be like left, but somehow, which I believe, like God spared me from like doing that, and I turned away from it. I don't know how I got to the point of turning away from it. I don't remember I just remember like turning away from it, and then like I never had anything like that, or like a suicide attempt again in my life. But I would say, like, again, like talking to people listening, like, you are only one person, and your life and your footprint, your thumbprints, your everything that you put on into this world and is so important and so needed. And if you are feeling disoriented or lost, there are people there who can help, and there are people you can reach out to. And if there's not, I don't know the hotline number. It's off the top of my head, but there's that line as well. But I would say and throughout the years, especially, I mean, middle school, high school years, like I did have friends who did lose their lives to that. And that also, like, like, I didn't vocalize any of this until I was in college years, to my parents and my family. And then even, like, my sisters, I think more recently I, like, told them, and, like, they had no idea about what was going on back in those years. But yeah, the isolation that I experienced, I'm like, it's a real thing. I mean, but again, it's like, shedding light on it is where you have to start, even if it's painful. But again, it took me time to get there.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I believe that, again, mental health is something that is not talked about enough.
Yeah.
Especially in the industry where we are currently working in. So what would you say to a person that's struggling and that is trying to make it, and that is having, it's having all the hardships and the tribulations that you went through? What would you, as a teacher, as a mentor, what would you tell them?
I would go back to myself being 13, 14. And I would just sit with that younger Isabel, and we would just breathe and just sit. Starting there. Like, something it sounds so simple, but in and of itself, of just recognizing that in of itself is a gift. And then moving forward from there, whatever that looks like. I want to also preface of, like, a lot of times, especially I've found in American culture, and I experienced this more recently because I recently visited a friend in Germany. The pace of life is so different in Europe. To hear everything in America is always the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And even in opera is notorious for that. It's notorious for the overworking, we got to hit the grind, we got to keep going. I've heard of people, like, not even, taking just a break throughout the day, of just like, oh, we're going to just go from the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And the reason I say I would start with the younger version of myself and breathing is because it's so important to take care of yourself mentally, emotionally, spiritually first, before even starting a list or even thinking about a list. That is sub-basement in my book. Sub-basement. Because if I can't even take care of my whole self, then burn the list, burn the book, burn the scores. Like, we can't move forward from there. No way. It's not worth it. Not worth my health. Not worth that. Whoever is listening, not worth your health. whatever that score or whatever that work that you're pursuing is. Take care of yourself in the process. Absolutely. And breathe.
So if I were to give you these pictures without saying who they are, can you take them?
Okay.
And
no.
You don't have to show them.
Oh
but
my god. So we got the first one, and I can share a little bit about this.
Tell me about that
yeah,
girl.
This girl. Oh my gosh. Wow. So this was from. Wow. You're really taking me back. Okay. So, this was right. Wow. And we were just talking about it too. This was a couple months after that intense car conversation with my mom, for me sticking with choir. And then I went a little step further and I was like, Mom, I want to try out for America's Got Talent. And we waited out in the rain in, I believe it was Charlotte, North Carolina, somewhere. But anyway, we waited out in the rain. My sister was with me, and a friend from high school was with me. And we drove from our town of Wake Forest, North Carolina, like, dark 30. I think it was like 3:30 in the morning, something crazy. And we were in this cattle call. It was endless and endless. I mean, we were just there, and we like would rotate. Like, I think my mom would like get food, but we would like keep our place in line, and someone would go to the bathroom. We would just keep rotating. Like, it was just like how you see on TV. Like, it is that.
But did you want to actually audition or just go listen?
No, so I actually like wanted to audition, like, and so you would have to go through like these lines and lines, many lines, many checkpoints, and what you see on TV, which I guess I'm spoiling a little bit if you don't already know, this cattle call that they do, you don't meet whoever the celebrity judges are. You meet whoever they assigned for that city, the producer of the show or assistant producer, whatever. And they usually are assigned to a certain city, and then they hear certain singers or performers, if you will, because America's Got Talent is not just for singers; it's for many different talents and different art forms, and if you will. What did I sing? I still remember. Yeah, so I sang Billie Holiday's "God Bless the Child," and my voice was definitely not at like. The depth and the nuances of Billie Holiday's voice was not in little. Yeah, I just turned 15. It was not in 15-year-old Isabel's
But again,
voice.
again, the moment though.
But seizing the moment, yeah. So again, I mean, I want to see the time of like. This version of Isabel though was not at the place of being like failure fueling me forward. Actually, like when I didn't get America's Got Talent, I was like, I was so disappointed. I was like, oh, I didn't get it. And my sister auditioned for as well, which was helpful that she was there. She was like, I remember her saying, she's like, I didn't receive it. And as I'm reflecting and thinking about it now, she was like, Isabel, just because it's no doesn't mean it's just because it's no doesn't mean it's never. It just means not now. So
that's probably the best.
This version of Isabel. Oh my gosh.
So
yeah.
I have a little bit more saved up for you here. First of all, talk to me about the inquisitive typist. Who is that person?
The inquisitive typist. The inquisitive typist is my pen name. For poetry, for poems that I write and still write. The inquisitive typist was, the inception of it began when COVID-19 hit. I didn't have a name for the inquisitive typist yet. That name didn't come about to be, but as far as like extensive poetry and writing of itself started, I just come back from New York City, back to LA, where I was at in 2020, and for the most of 2019 through 2021, I got back from New York, and then everything started shutting down, and it was crazy. I mean, I would say of course, music has always been a safe haven for for me a refuge, but also writing as well. I wrote a lot during all my schooling years, and I found that as a safe place for me to be. And I just remember being in my room in LA, and I was like, I have to document this somehow. And so I've on my phone. I don't have the physical journals anymore, but I have scanned copies of all of my entries throughout the pandemic, and there were poems that were written throughout the way. I was like, I wonder if I would just keep writing poems. And so in 2021, I remember writing a poem one day, and then I signed it as the Inquisitive Typist, and I was like, okay, that's it.
So the name came after.
Name came after.
Oh.
Yes.
So I want you to walk through me these two beautiful poems.
Okay.
And yeah, just walk me through them.
You want me to read them, or?
Yes, read them aloud and then just walk me through it.
So this one is from December 27th of last year. Not yet. All I know is that I don't know. I've seen doors open and shut, yet my heart is ready to receive this. That no is okay. What's next is not certain, yet I'm grateful for what has been placed in my hands, for the breath that fills my lungs to sing and exhale through the not yet. The Inquisitive Typist. So this was at the end of my audition season in 2022. My goal was to have a year-long Young Artist program. I had already been offered, and I'm so thankful to be returning to summer program this year. But for the year-long stuff after the summer, that wasn't confirmed yet. And so the word of, and the two words not yet kind of were like spiraling through, because me and my mom had such a close relationship, and she'd be like, oh, Isabel, it's just not yet. And I was like, okay, yeah, it's not yet, but I'm like, okay. And it was like
when is yet coming?
Yeah, when is yet coming? And so then it brought me back to this. And then talking about the breath that fills my lungs, and just thinking about the fragility of life, and just thinking bigger picture of like what I'm doing this even for. Even if it's not yet, it doesn't mean I'm gonna stop, you know. So that's not yet. The second one. Oh my gosh. The Valentine's Day poetry cycle, which was written for this year's Valentine's Day. It's 9 poems. The first one is content. Second is poetry. Number 3 is quiet. 4th is overthinking. 5 is undefined. 6 is we. 7 is navigation. 8 is at the time. And 9, unwavering. And then there's a description of it. But the gist of this was, again, I've never been in a romantic relationship ever. I say the closest I've ever been is the DMs, the direct messages, like meaning like I would converse with someone, or I would maybe like talk with them on the phone or whatever, but I would never get past to like a formal relationship, or like a formal date, if you will. But this year, like since turning 26, I've just come to a place where like, you know, like I am sure of myself with or without someone. Yeah. And that is the first step. And so that's what writing content got me to this place of like, you know what? I want to also broaden my, you know, challenge my writing style, and to write about perspectives I'm not well versed in. And then also to give it as a gift for someone if they are in a place that they can relate to with this, one of these poems. Because Valentine's Day, there's so much that goes around Valentine's Day, and me being single, it's one of those things where it can be triggering. But for me, it is triggering, but in a way where I'm just like, you know what, like this is the season that I'm in right now, being single. I'm like, I'm going to make the most of, like, seize moments, you know, and also first and foremost, take care of myself. So that is... Love yourself first before you love others. Absolutely. Pour inside, pour for yourself before pouring for the others. Absolutely. That's actually really good. So, one step back. You have never been in a relationship.
How would you define love then? What's your definition of love? Because it's way broader than just being in a relationship. We know that. But what's your vision of love?
Um,
Current and potential.
Current and potential.
Yeah.
I guess it's twofold. Like I've said before, like it starts with loving yourself, but also it's like for me it goes to of of being able to I there have been so many. The reason why I take a pause is because there have been so many um, different things throughout my life that have where I've written about what I thought was love or what I thought was, this thing. There's so much nuances to that word. Um,
And what was that you thought?
I would say with what I thought with love was is more of how the feeling. There's a feeling which I've read more about. There's a specific word like limerence, or even like a longing for something or chasing a feeling, whatever. But that's a temporary thing. The thing that love for me is something that's steadfast. It's the nitty gritty. It's the behind the scenes. It's when it's not Instagram worthy, when it's not pretty, meaning the work that is put into a relationship, the communication, even with friendships, they don't just work by themselves. You're continually working on yourself, but then also it's like when you're in a relationship and with love, it should never, I'm coming to a point where it's like you should never be subtracting who you are in order to be in a relationship. If anything, the relationship should be an additional and a complementary thing to who you already are.
So what you're saying is to not compromise the person you are.
Absolutely
which
not.
I think it's fair.
Absolutely not. Because it goes back to, when you first were starting off, before you define the relationship. Because even one of my poems, it's undefined, and then it goes into we. Within that pronoun we, it should never. You have to think about. I mean, this is really cheesy now that I say it. When you think of the pronoun we, you also have to think about me, defining like who am I in the we. It has that change, and if it's changed, then you have to ask yourself why.
That's deep. Wow.
That was for free. Hey. You're welcome.
I'm trying not to laugh so bad right now.
I know. It's okay. Sorry. I had to quote Shrek once. You're welcome.
Okay, so trying to wrap up this in a way, I have two more important questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
The first one is a question that I would usually ask at the beginning, but it's completely fine to ask at the end as well. What is your definition of leadership?
Yeah. I had a lot of time to think about that in college. I was a part of, at Baylor University, there was these community programs called Living Learning Centers, and I was in one that was titled Lead Living Learning Center, and it was in a residential hall called Allen Dawson Hall. Allen was was the male side, and then Dawson was the female side, but it was a co-ed building. Anyway, so I took this intro to leadership class. We all had to take it if you're in the dorm, and so I took that class, and at the end of it we had to define what you specified. And a couple of months ago I was searching on Google, and I found my old blog website again from like
You had a blog website?
I had a blog website for the class. We had to develop like this.
Oh,
It was
okay.
so cheesy because I I was still like holding on to the thread. I don't know of like maybe I'll like still swim on the side. Like it was all like aquatic theme. It was so cheesy. There's like fish and like it was. It's so you can still if you want to look it up. It's it's called take it. It's like if you do like deep Isabel Randall deep dive to leadership, like it will pop up
Everybody,
on
look
Google.
at her, look at her website.
Yeah, it's so great. And I defined leadership. My definition of leadership at the time honestly hasn't changed that much to how I view it now. Even now, looking at 8, 9 years ago, my definition of leadership is not something about, of course, what I can bring to the table, not just that, but also relying on those I'm leading to inform my leadership, which I view as what I can learn from them and how I can continue my process of being a lifelong learner. Because I find, and I have found from being in leadership capacities, whether that was as a resident assistant or community leader in the dorms at Baylor University, or whether leading different teams to where we would serve for different countries in Malaysia and Kenya, like being a leader is not just from the top going down, looking down. I view it as like we're sitting at the table and it's kind of like what we can contribute. Not to say that I'm not going to have a plan, if you will, but I would say leadership goes to looking around of who you're leading and how you can lean on them as a team. And then
Camaraderie.
Camaraderie aspect, that's key. The second thing also is being able to empower others to make an impact in their communities, respectively, and how doing that is equipping them with the tools to be able to do that. Because, again, just for example, I had an opportunity. My first teaching experience with music was in Malaysia in 2018. And I remember being so nervous for teaching that class. And I remember one of the teammates I had who was like, we were like co-leading the voice class. We would like rotate on different lessons. And I remember she was like, just have fun. And I was like, what? She was like, just have fun. I was like, what about the, I was like, what about the plan? Like, and she's like, just have fun.
Go with the flow.
And I was like, oh. And I didn't understand, again, I didn't understand until saying back to myself now. What she meant was just living in the moment and like really taking it for what it was, because.
Which brings us also back to the whole, stage fright and
Yes.
and acceptance to failure.
Yeah, because leadership stems from that. It's like if I'm not sure and like and also acknowledging I will not and should not have it all today. It can't.
Otherwise, it would be too easy.
Right? Then it's just
it
like
makes sense.
Then it makes life predictable, and then it's just like okay,
boring.
Very boring. Then brings us back to like those sci-fi movies where it's like, okay, Automatron, I'm ready for like my peanut butter and jelly now, like, and just like hologram or holographic meatloaf, my favorite. Like, yeah. So I had to do SpongeBob at least once. You know this.
So, there is this thing we do at the very end where we ask you to write a question or ask a question, looking at the camera, to the next person we're going to interview without knowing who the next person is going to be. So what is your next question?
My next question for the next person to be interviewed is, what do you want your footprint to be in the world?
That is awesome. Well, Isabel, thank you.
Thank you
for being here. And thank you for giving us your time. The crew says thank you. And, well, we hope to have you back in the show.
Love to be back.
Bye.
Bye.